They say the Szgany farm stood just beyond the second ridge where the road turned to clay and the map to rumor. Its orchard sunk low as if the land itself had taken a breath and refused to let it out again. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from, and what's the time in the comments. The spring ran chalky there, and in years of good rain the apples kept a film like milk on their skins that mothers in the parish rubbed away with apron hems and did not speak of again. The family were not new. Their name appears in a road order of 1832, and in vestry minutes where such names go when a fence must be laid, or a ditch must keep its promise. In 1861, when men measured each other by company roll and the trains began to split the valleys, the Szganys did not ride to muster. They were farm people, and nobody balked at farm people who kept to their acres, while the world broke itself on a larger road. The first official mention of the family that spring, apart from tithable lists and a season's seed requisition, lives on the back of a church notice for Lenten devotions in a physician's narrow hand. Szgany household, 3 adults, 2 youths. Note peculiar uniformity of pulse between subjects not kin by blood. Skin cool and damp, eyes manifest a lenticular reflex at low lamp. Unusual. The physician who wrote this, Patton H. Mays, had gone down to inspect for diphtheria and came back with a pocket of puzzlement and 2 damp handkerchiefs that he burned behind his surgery because he could not trust the smell. By then the parish had already learned to measure its hour by the Szganys. The evening Angelus bell caught on something at their hill that set the tone back upon itself a trifle thick, like the way a hymn repeats in a wooden church when the boards agree with it. The sexton said the second echo was not in the bell and not in the hollow, and that the priest should tell him what it was in. The priest said it was in the Lord's timing, which comforted no one. They were in church twice monthly, the older man kneeling one pew from the back with his hat in his hands like a man who knows the shape of public reverence and hopes it will admit him. The younger woman kept her head down through the sermons and her mouth still under the Gloria, and when she lifted her eyes at the dismissal, there was a small white throw of light upon them, as if the oil lamps threw back their breath across her cornea in some trick of angle. Tricked eyes can be explained. The organist said he had seen cat's eye reflections before at dusk, and would not be made foolish by pretty things, and then he stopped talking about it when the boy at the end of the pew looked up with the same white, and did not blink until the dismissal was done. The Szganys worked late. On that, the farmers agreed. Men who hauled timber to the mill after sundown heard tapping in the orchard behind the house as if someone were counting, steady without hurry, the sort of exactness a mason keeps when he lays one more course than he should by lantern light. The tapping stopped if the hearer spoke. The tapping resumed if no one named it. A man who had served in Mexico said the sound was a Morse a man might use to speak to another man across a strange air. Then he remembered he was in a valley that liked to put its stories back into clean jars, and said only that the Szganys were precise. In the county bundle labeled Surgeon Dispatches, Local, 1861, there is a report on fevers of the nerves, a phrase that doctors with uniforms used against phenomena they could not get their finger under. Dr. Mays writes, subjects, family, show peculiar concordance in respiration and pulse when placed in same room and subjected to mild excitation, lamp lowered, prayer said. Not hysteria, no pallor, no common agitation. Rather a trained habit or an environmental concord. The room has odd length, 7 feet and some inches, and carries the whisper. He writes, and then strikes through. In darkness the eyes of the younger subjects give back a whiteness under the lids without direct source. He writes instead, reflex peculiar. A farmer's wife, whose words come to paper because a priest insisted, said the orchard trees had taken on a posture that sprang like a congregation in a procession, each branch trained to a minute curve that did not belong to the species, as if the wind had pressed them into a chant and they had learned to keep it. She said she walked between those trees and knew exactly how long her steps must be, because the orchard told her so, and when she came out onto the road her breath made a choice without asking her. She did not like to speak in front of men about choices that the breath made. A ledger at the general store carries a run of purchases under the family account that does not fit the season. Whiting, lampblack, fine sand, tight-lidded glass jars, 20. When coal grows dear and lard thin, glass jars are a luxury, yet the family paid cash, the notes folded along their length as people in the hills do. The storekeeper wrote beside the entry, small in the margin where he would not have to commit, "Night paint?" and drew a line through his own word, as if ashamed of imitating a peddler's advertisement. The term belongs to the new luminous compounds from the cities, calcium sulfide if the pamphlets are true, paint that soaks up sunshine and grants a poor green reactive light in the dark hours. Children like such paint as they like everything that glows when it should not. The Szgany jars did not go to children. They went down the road across a hill with an orchard that learned to count. Another county paper holds in the clerk's spare hand, road complaint, Szgany Lane. Cartwheels turn as if pulled when no man is in traces. Witnesses speak as one, recommend ditch widened. This is not a marvel and not a physics. Clay roads pull at the feet and at wheels when a rain sits in the layer beneath the dust. A ditch is a prayer answered with a shovel. Still, the phrase, "as if pulled," repeats in the quarter after that in two other complaints, and none of those men used each other's words. The parson's journal, which he kept to fix his own thoughts in the week's exhaustion, records a home visit on March 29th. Pressed to enter rear room, refused, door present without knob, could hear, a low vibration. I will not be made a fool by nerves. The younger woman asked if the sound of the prayer would carry if the door remained put. This is a specious question. I refused to mistake a craft for a sacrament. He underlined refused and regretted it later, if the way he lifted his pen over the word and put it down again is anything to go on. By April, the younger boy, he would have been 13 if the baptismal lines are read correctly, stood still so long in the orchard that a neighbor called his name and got no answer. And when the boy did turn, he moved as a soldier turns on parade, but with a looseness like a reed under water, his joints arguing with his will and losing. His mother, if the older woman is his mother, put her hand on the boy's chest in a gesture that repeats in forms across the county. Flat palm at the sternum, a reminder, not pressure. The boy stopped twitching. He smiled with his lips shut and whistled between his teeth without moving his mouth. For this there is no good account, save that some men can. The whistle had a chord to it, not one note, but two, if a man is permitted to write such things down and pretend he is writing only what an ear would rightly measure. Mays, who did not frighten easily at symptoms that failed to consult his books, wrote hyperacusis with an irritability that tells you he did not believe he was naming anything solid. He had seen a miner come to pieces because a low continuous pitch in a new tunnel made his heart take bad advice. He had watched a choir girl put her hands to her ears when the organ coughed. The Szgany house had some of that about it, a place set to carry what should have fallen away. Neighbors became shy of sending their daughters up the hill. This is the way a living town legislates itself when it cannot trust a constable to do so. And yet in May, the parish women's circle brought broth and felt hats for the older man and left them on the stoop because he did not come when called. One wrote on a folded paper under the crock, "For the fast." She did not mean Lent. She meant that strange period that enters a house when someone powerful in it has decided that ordinary food should be lesser for a while. The women understood discipline. They did not understand why the Szganys had taken to sitting up until the third hour of the night and laying out little lines of sand on the floor, as if dividing a plank into equal parts and whispering what might have been numbers or might have been a prayer that had forgotten its words. The orchard took on a nightlight once that 3 people saw and later called different things, so that the words could not take the night from them. The teamster called it a poor foxfire, which belongs to fungus and wet rot, and amuses children who hunt it with jars. The parish woman called it a breath that hung, which is respectable talk for a fear that does not know how to ask for a chair. Mays, called out by a freeman who would not put a white man's fear to white men's paper, wrote in his notebook that there was a faint pale green along the lower limbs, such as can be made by phosphors under a lamp when the room is darked. Then erased the line because to write phosphors in a valley road is to get laughter later at the store when a man's back is turned. During Holy Week, a decision was made to ask the family to attend to the sacraments like everyone else, or else to stay home until their household had resolved what everyone else felt in the chest, but would not say in the mouth. The parson walked up the lane with the sexton who carried his hat instead of wearing it, and the two men paused at the apples and then did not talk about why they had paused. They knocked. The door opened on the older man who smelled of lamp oil and not of drink, and put his hand on the jamb above the priest's head, as if measuring his reach for some later work. "We prefer to make our prayer here," the old man said, and his voice had a calm in it that a person envies when his own breath will not keep the hour. He held up a scrap of paper on which someone had drawn 5 parallel lines, uneven and close, like a stave too small for the note a man would write on it. "We mark our petitions here," he said. "We keep to the figure." "What figure?" the parson asked, to give the man a chance at his own defense. "The one the orchard keeps at night," the old man said, and looked tired at having had to say it aloud, and in saying it lose the power that things have when left in privacy with a door kept shut. He would not say more. He closed the door. He did not bar it. He did not live in fear. He lived in a shape. The sexton went around back and looked at the shed where tools hung bright with attention, and the curve of the sharpening stone wore a trajectory too regular to be made by a man whose mind takes breaks. He saw jars with tight lids set in a row on a shelf, like little soldiers. He saw on the dirt floor tracks like lines a child draws with a stick to diagram jump rope, except these lines marked off distances too small, all alike, 5 and 5 and 5, stopping at the threshold and starting again on the other side, as if the door's wood were a measure that had to be accounted for. He told no one he had opened the shed door. He told 2 people he had walked around the house, and that the orchard made his temples hurt, which is a way a man with a faithful job has of saying that the world under his employer's God had made a choice without him. The war came up the roads like weather. Every county knew the sound of a drum before it knew what it would cost. And the Szgany farm looked on without uniform and without flag. That, too, is a position. Men excused men they needed as long as their plows worked and their orchards gave. But in June, when the county took its next census of might and found itself short, a list was made of households that kept their sons from the roll, and the Szgany name went on it. The note beside it reads, "Family not of English ways, the boy not right in the joints, defer." It is a cruelty that the clerk wrote "not right" in such a neat hand. Around that time, in the 6th month, with the air wanting thunder but denying it, the parson sat up at his desk to write a letter to the physician that he did not send. "Doctor, the family at the 2nd Ridge keep ours not decent in Christian order. They set their bodies to a scheme that refuses interruption. They smell of lamp and damp. Their pupils show a white return at the low light. Their orchard answers bells. The boy whistles with closed teeth. Tell me if these be medical things you can answer with your bag, or if they are better called sins of craft that require an older language." He put the letter aside because the war took the post 2 days later, and because he did not know how to speak older language to people with seed to plant. The 4th official document that summer concerning the family is a road order again, as if the world would insist upon bringing the story into a ledger where men are comfortable. Cut a trench along Szgany Lane to lay the water off the wheel ruts and prevent mischief. The lane takes to drawing. That personification, takes to drawing, is the only time the county admits that a road may choose. By August, 2 things were plain to anyone who put a hand to the doorposts. The house took sound and gave it back to the hand, and the people living within it had learned to make themselves of the same material. You could call it discipline if you wanted to admire something of it. You could call it a practice if you wished the word that argued with prayer without quite opposing it. Mays wrote, "Conditioned conquered," which is the underhand way a man of science has of saying, "This is training," not a visitation. He wrote, "Remove the parties from the room and the condition will lessen." He then wrote on a separate line, "Not possible," and underlined it, perhaps not because it could not be done, but because it could not be done by any person who had come to love what the condition made his body feel in that room, namely, order. In September, an apple fell in that orchard and did not bruise. This is foolishness and a trick of grass. But the woman whose child brought the apple to her hand told others about it and would not be dissuaded. When she bit it, the flesh under the skin had gone to meal, while the skin kept shine. She threw it into the yard for the hogs, and the hog did not take it. She slept badly after that. One does not have to be wise to read her misery. The world has a right way to degrade, and when it will not take up that right way, the mind grows thin, trying to coax it back. The last piece before the winter that year that puts itself to paper was written in a soldier's diary, a man on furlough who took the old road one evening because he did not want to be spoken to and thought the ridge would keep him. He writes, "Passed the second orchard, saw a sort of pale, stopped, heard tapping as at a telegraph, except there is no post. After, they came to the door all at once, as if by signal inside them. Their eyes like a cat's in low fire. Felt my own head move to account I did not begin. A soldier hardened by other things will confess to fear in a home valley, where he would rather make a story that puts him in front. His confession stands because he wrote it in a book that was not for us. It would be kinder to say that the family adjusted their ways to please the parish, that their sand lines were wiped, that the jars were emptied, that the orchard mistook its count and gave apples like the ones the grandparents ate, that the boy's jaw learned to laugh instead of bite down on a cord. What comes instead is a physician's winter note with a ring of soot on its edge where it lay too near the stove. 3 subjects examined at Szgany, tapping in sleep. Pupillary reflex abnormal at low lamp, white reflex, leukochoria, seen in 2 at angle. Recommend, cease night practices, open window, daylight, dispersal into wider rooms. The older man asked if the figure can be broken by light alone. There is no figure, I said. He smiled as at a child and said, "Doctor, it is not yours to name." He underlined "not yours" and next to it, because irritation is a mercy when you fear you are looking at something you cannot govern, he wrote, "Superstition." That winter the valley took to listening for a whistle that was not on the pump schedule, and walked in their kitchens around the second minute after the hour as if they had become a town of men who hoped their bodies would not choose account without their permission. When the lambing came on and the small clocks in the stalls began, you could hear in the barn a distant tapping that might have been the hollow crack of old ice on a water trough, and if you stood at the trough with a hand on the rim, you could feel in the long bones of your arm that a house across 2 fields and a lane made door panels hum at a frequency your ear did not hold. Those who favored the priest called it a strange temptation toward a false coordination, which is a good phrase for a horror one wishes to forgive because it is well arranged. Those who favored the doctor called it a bad room's effect made worse by night and by people who had come to think of their breath as a thing that belongs to a plan. Those who kept to their plows said little and put one foot down after the other like men who count in a way that cannot be taken by a house's whim. What comes next requires someone to stand in the Szgany lane with one hand on the fence and the other on the sternum and say, whether, when the lamp is turned down in that rear room, and the jars are uncapped and the white chalk lines are counted through, anything comes into the house that was not already in the bones of the people within it, and in the timber and the clay that undergird their floor. Nothing from outside is necessary to make what happened there. That is perhaps the terror that will not be named. By winter, the farm had arranged itself around a pattern it would not confess and could not stop. What neighbors call habit, doctors call conditioning, and priests call temptation toward an order not asked of them. Each word is a kind of fence, and inside the fence, the same things kept happening. The orchard gave a light you could argue away if you wanted to live clean. On moonless nights, a faint band lay along the low limbs, not bright, no lantern trick, just a poor, patient pallor that made fruit wood look like bone. It was the sort of glow you can coax from a phosphor when a lamp has warmed a wall all evening, and then you cut the flame and learn that the paint remembers. A town that has not said the word phosphor can still recognize memory in wood. The jar lids stacked along the shed's back beam had a trace of that same remembrance along their tin lips. You could lay a palm to one and draw it back with the certainty that something in the metal had learned how to anticipate a change in light. Dr. Mays came 2 more times and found what any decent mind would. Not a devil, not a disease you can cut, but a set of conditions that make bodies answer their room. He wrote, "Remove subjects to daylight, break routine, widen space, ban night practices." He might as well have said, "Unmake winter." In his notes he makes himself plain and therefore vulnerable. Breath, pulse, and small motions entrain, synchronization in the presence of a repeated cue. The rear room carries low pitch. Standing in the doorway, I feel a vibration along the mastoid. Bone hears before ear. He was a cautious man with his nouns. He wrote leukocoria once more with a question mark, then crossed it and wrote photographic artifact likely, because to name a white reflex is to invite fear into a house. He was trying to govern fear by choosing the language that would bear the least weight. The parson tried his language too. He told them to sleep early, to let the bell keep the hour instead of their jars and chalk lines. He spoke of Sabbath rest and the hazard of novelties that cast themselves as devotions. He asked the older man to stop the tapping. The older man looked past him toward the orchard and asked a question the parson could not parry without admitting he had heard it himself. If the trees call a beat, is it sin to answer? An orchard cannot call, men call. Yet the parson had stood between those trunks and felt the regular suggestion at the back of the eyes where tears prepare and do not fall. The same suggestion he felt at the rear room door when the lamp was turned down. He said, because he must, "Nature calls for the Lord's rhythm, not yours." It sounded like a paraphrase he'd memorized, and not a sentence he owned. A woman from the next farm told how she found the younger woman of the house standing at the doorway, with her head a little tilted, left ear toward the lintel, as if listening to the shape of the wood. She was smiling like when a baby takes to milk, the neighbor said, and then she shook her head because that was not a kind thing to say about a woman who had work enough. She said she made a noise with her boot heel once. The younger woman blinked as if the world had interrupted her with a small mercy. "We'll be done," she said. "We only need the shape to hold for a little while." The boy frightened people in ways they were ashamed to name. It was not his fault. He had grown into height without filling, a jointed creature held together by will and timing. He could stand very still until some minute no one else had marked arrived, and then his head would turn with a smoothness that argued he was answering something larger than a call to his name. He could whistle chords with his mouth closed. He did not brag about this. He seemed relieved when someone put a palm against his sternum, an instruction taught by a woman who had learned to interrupt music in a body as gently as possible. He smiled then the way a child smiles when a fever breaks for an hour. A mason with a good hand put his palm to the rear room arch, and then reported the missing keystone as if broken masonry explained the rest. The load was in the brick, not the stone. The arch would hold. The comfort of a solved joint did not travel far. He walked back down the lane tapping his fingers on his thigh 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he caught himself and made the taps wrong on purpose, and felt like he had fought with a child. The county asked whether men had been drilled up there. That is how fear in wartime explains coordination. A list was drawn of families who might have taught their boys to turn and breathe together in a way that would be useful to a captain. The Szgany name was mentioned, and then set aside because nobody had heard a shout or step in cadence, only the quiet tapping and a hum that did not belong to a man's throat but to wood. "They are not drilling," the deputy said, half to reassure and half to say, "Not yet." Accounts began to contradict themselves so cleanly that you could tell they were true. A teamster heard the tapping exactly at the second minute after the hour and wrote the time down with a stub pencil. A woman fixing a lamp wick heard nothing at that hour and then later washing a cup, felt her jaw lengthen with an intention that was not hers, and set the cup down hard so it would not break. A soldier home on leave said he stood at the fence and counted, and the house counted back. A clerk in town mocked him, and then, later that week, in his own kitchen, stacked knives at equal distances without meaning to, and hated himself for measuring. People began to add useless motions to their days to prove those motions belonged to them. A rumor came that jars labeled night paint had been opened in the rear room, and that the family used the poor green afterglow to mark tiny distances on a board, like the way a watchmaker sits with scale and light long after decent people put lamps out. A man who had worked in a depot and seen numbered gauges said the board looked like a stave set too small for a note and too precise for a prayer. He wanted it to be sin so he could speak about it with old words. He suspected it was a craft he didn't know, and shame kept his mouth. The orchard's geometry, if it can be called that without flattering fear, made its own law. Limbs that had never been trained held to a slight regular curve. Twine left on a branch overnight cut the bark along the same measure at 5 and 5 and 5 inches, as if a hand had passed in the dark and pressed the string to teach the tree a lesson. Children learned to walk the rows by a count not given by their mothers. When they came out onto the lane, they stumbled because the world had gone back to being irregular, which is to say safe. The parson's notebooks, which were meant to be private and became public by stubborn survival, show a slow turn from disapproval to a confusion not far from awe. Visited S. house, he wrote. Prayed at door. Felt my prayer set upon a lattice I did not call. This is not right. I cannot deny it was easy. He underlined easy, then wrote, ease is not proof of grace, and then left a line and added, nor of the opposite. He had begun to distrust sentences that ended with a period. Mays kept his hands busy because hands at work keep the mind from arranging coincidences into shapes. He filled a page with sensible admonitions. Take the family outdoors at first light. Make them eat bread at regular hours. Forbid tapping at sleep. Move them to a larger room. Then he tore the page out and started again, because to prescribe bread and sunlight to people who had already eaten and seen light was to pretend that winter is a personal choice. He wrote a plainer line. Do not put children in small rooms and ask them to hold one note for a long time. It was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis with the diagnosis removed. The county women's circle returned with broth and the smallest, most ruthless charity. Advice. Douse the lamp, one said. Walk at odd times, said another. Put the jars away, said a third, and the younger woman lifted her eyes and said carefully, as if not to insult their kindness, we put the jars away. It is still here. She did not say what it was. The women went home and moved their own spoons to wrong distances without thinking, and then set them right again, and went to bed angry at themselves. There were nights the orchard kept silence so perfectly that men declared themselves fools by sunrise. There were nights when the house gave a minute, dry sound from within the door panels like a filament relaxing, though there were no filaments and no current. Those were the nights people remembered and were ashamed of remembering. They said foxfire, or owls, or settling. They said, the cold makes wood talk. They said, the pump's valve leaks a whisper on its own schedule. They said these things, and then, when a child in the next room began to tap a sequence in sleep, they rose and placed a palm at the child's chest and waited for the breath to choose itself again. A harmless experiment made things worse. A cousin brought a metronome, a pawned luxury for a teacher who had left town when the war took her pupils, and set it on the rear room floor. He meant to prove to the old man that ticking was an instrument's trick, not a house's. At first the family ignored it. The boy held still. The younger woman kept washing. Then the metronome found the room's length and corrected itself, a tiny shift of weight on a crooked plank. It settled into an integer relation with the room's breath and the orchard's quiet and the old man's jaw. For one long, humiliating moment, 4 bodies in that room took the same pause and resumed together like a single thing. The cousin stopped the metronome. No one spoke of it again. The cousin took to eating at odd hours and stepping with wrong feet first. From the lane, a person could see the chalk marks through the rear window when the lamp was out. parallel bands 555 thinning to nothing in the corner where soot had stained the plaster in long, close lines from an old, bad draft. You could tell yourself those were only smoke trails. You could tell yourself that the marks on the floor were only where sacks had dragged. You could tell yourself that the jars were only for pickling and not for light. None of these sentences would be lies by themselves. The boy's eyes in lamplight had that pale return again, a white reflex that medicine treats as omen and photography as artifact. At a certain angle, the pupil gave back no black. It is possible to live safely believing in angles. People do so in cities all the time. In a valley where lamp oil is dear and men watch the light like a shared animal, a white pupil is a topic you handle once and then put away. In December, frost made a scaffold of every weed and the world grew lawful by sparkle. The orchard did not sparkle like the rest. It kept a duller sheen, as if moisture would not take to its bark where it should. Men kicked the bases of trees to test the wood for rot and said nothing, because the sound they got back was not rot, and not the usual clap of sound wood either. It was a hollower thing that raised gooseflesh because it suggested empty, where there should be sap. A man can be wrong about timber. The body is rarely wrong about hollow. One night, one that a teamster, a parish woman, and the parson all wrote down, which is the only reason it stays. The tapping came from the orchard, and from the rear room in the house, and from the boy's jaw at once. It was not loud. It was only exact. A train far off on the new line threw a long, thin tone across the ridge, and for a second, the orchard and the door and the boy's teeth seemed to love it. Then the train passed on. The family stayed. The train had not brought anything. It had named something. The parson wrote, "I have begun to suspect that we built a thing." He meant the house and the habit together. He underlined "we" and then he covered the word with a fingertip until the paper made a spot of grease. He turned the page and wrote lines of scripture until the page could carry no more single letters. He had lost the sentence that would make sense of what the orchard had become. By epiphany, people told their children not to walk the lane at the second minute after the hour, though none of them could say how the hour would be known without a clock. They built a law out of the memory of fear. They told the children to count wrong when they felt an urge to count. The children laughed. Then the children learned, without being told, to put a hand to their chests when a dog 2 farms over barked on a still night. The people who made this new law did not put it in the ledger where road orders and seed lists live. It went into hands. In that winter's coldest week, Mays wrote his last clear note. We must widen the room, open the window, and dissolve the measure. He had begun to write, take down the arch, and then he stopped because the arch was not the fault, and because a man from outside has no authority to advise demolition to a family whose house has weathered 3 generations. He added, if it cannot be unbuilt, then the habit must be starved. The body forgets when it is allowed to misalign itself on purpose for a long time. He meant, step wrong, sing off the beat, keep the knife and spoon uneven and steel yourself to the feel of it. He did not write the hardest prescription, love the wrong. He did not know if he could, and a man should not ask of others what he cannot offer. The orchard stood through it all with its small disobediences. The jars on the shelf kept their labels turned just a little too right, as if a hand had lined them once too carefully. The rear room's paneling asked, now and then, to move, and did not. The boy slept and tapped and stopped when a palm invited him back. The old man kept his hat in church like a man who knows the shape of his parish's patients. The younger woman watched the door and listened to the lintel and felt the mercy of interruption when it came. The town ate bread and meat when it had them, and in the kitchen spoons sat at wrong distances and were fixed and set wrong again. A few men suggested the only clean cure: open every door at once and let the winter clear it, even if it meant the house would not hold its heat again. Those men liked solutions. They did not love the people in the house. The parson said no without saying why. Mays said no because physics, habit, and love were not going to be corrected by letting wind through a room. The deputy said no because a town that has broken a family's door has made a law it will not soon recall. The family, for their part, did not invite counsel. They accepted broth and advice with equal grace. They did not deny the orchard. They did not boast of the rear room. The older man said once, for the record that exists in two men's memories and on no paper, "We did not ask for a figure. We only found ourselves in one." It is the most terrible sentence of that winter, because it makes the world the author. It tempts the mind to say, devil, or design, when what stands in the lane is worse for being neither. There was one more thing. On the shed wall next to the beam where the jars sat, someone had scratched with a nail a row of short vertical marks, 4 in a diagonal, 5, then 5, then 5, then 5. The count stopped at 47. Under it, in a hand that tried to be neat, "Do not open." The phrase could have meant the jars, the door, the measure, a person's mouth at the wrong minute. It could have meant everything that is harder to close than to open. In February, the ground froze clean, and the sound of carts carried farther than men liked. The Szgany lane lay like a taut string from the lower gate to the house, and people began to avoid stepping on it at the second minute after an hour, as if a road could transmit a habit through a boot heel. No one wrote this rule down. It still worked. The idea of a cure dwindled to 2 proposals, both unkind. The first was to pull the rear room down to studs, drag the boards out to the yard and burn them so the measure could not hold. The second was to divide the family, one to each cousin's loft, and insist they live with ordinary walls and crooked thresholds until the bodies forgot. The first would have ruined a winter, the second would have ruined a family. The parson could not bring himself to bless either ruin. Dr. Mays wrote privately that the second was better medicine and worse mercy. He wrote also that music, once learned by tissue and air together, does not depart just because a man changes rooms. Those jars, 20 at first, then fewer, then none, and later more, came back into the stories then. Someone said the labels had been turned inward. Someone else said they had been scraped off. Someone said they had been washed and left to dry, and a faint poor light rose from their lips where a few particles had dried. If you were willing to live in daylight, you could say, old calcium sulfide powders will do that for a little while if a lamp has warmed them. If you were willing to live where the rear room kept its law, you could say, the jars knew night. The orchard bent its will into something like doctrine. Limbs that should have wandered obeyed an invisible curve. In morning frost, those curves reappeared like writing traced by a careful child. 5, 5, 5, then a break, then 5 again. A carpenter remarked aloud that if you put a harp on its side and forgot all the nobility of it, and had to make it from crooked wood and want, you might get a line of rooms and a door that asked to move and an orchard that preferred a tone. He laughed as soon as he had said it, ashamed at comparing parish trees to a gentlewoman's instrument. In the afternoon he found himself pushing back the urge to count his steps, and he set his hammer down so hard it bent a nail. 3 events that month drew the county tighter. First, a neighbor girl, 8, woke in the second minute after 2 and walked to the door and lifted her hand before she had a thought to put into the gesture. Her mother, who had learned from the Szgany woman without confessing to having learned, placed a palm against the child's sternum and hushed a shape she could not see. The child went back to bed and slept. The mother sat on the floor and cried softly because it felt like battling something too modest to name and too stubborn to win against. In the morning, she took her bread out early and set her knives at wrong distances on purpose. She felt brave and silly and hungry. Second, a man down valley set a metronome in his pantry. To get to the truth of it, he said to his brother. The pantry agreed with the tick, then corrected it by the thickness of a shingle. The plates in the cupboard leaned into the tick and then, once, leaned away. The man came white to his wife to tell her of his cleverness. She told him to put the thing in the shed. For a week thereafter his jaw ached at evensong. Third, the parson tried to bless the rear room. He was an honest man and made the blessing without theater. He opened the window and said prayer the way men do when they fear they are about to be laughed at by the universe. He pressed his thumb in chalk on the lintel. He turned the lamp down and kept talking. In the dim, as his eyes tried to manage the change, the panels made a dry little petulant sound, no more than wood letting go of warm, and his breath stopped and resumed exactly with the last word of his amen and the boy's closed-mouth whistle. That is the most careful sentence he ever wrote about his own discomfort, that his breath was taken into a timing not of his choosing or God's. After that, he wrote no more admonitions. He wrote notes to himself about light. He wrote, "Open windows even when it is cruel." He wrote, "Confusion is safer than a false order." He added, and then erased for fear of flattering a terror, "The wrong minute is a lie the body loves." Mays went harder into measurements, which is what a man does when a house refuses to give up its theory. He brought a tuning fork and a string and a pocket watch, and he let the fork hum against lintel and rail and door and table. He wrote down where the hum took. He drew a crude map and marked the places where the hairs on his hand stood with letters as if he were plotting a tonic triad across farm carpentry. He hated himself a little for the feeling the experiment gave him, a clarity, because clarity is the seduction of systems that forget persons. He confessed as much in a margin and then appealed to medicine to absolve him by writing bone hears before ear and leaving God and devils out of it. The boy grew stranger and more dear. He would stand under a tree and hum so low the ear took it for air. Birds corrected their perches to keep watch of him. A dog lay down at his feet with a trembling jaw and slept as if drugged. 2 times he descended the stairs in a manner his joints objected to, as if his body preferred to coil around a note rather than obey a tread, and the older man lifted him with a grunt and pressed a hand flat against the boy's chest until the breath came back to morals. The family did not call this a rite. They did not name it. They loved the boy. People began to speak of the family as if rumors could reduce them to manageable shapes. Foreign, because the name sounded not like theirs. Papist, because they kept a figure. Witches, because the orchard obeyed. Rebels, because they did not march. Cowards, because they did not leave. All the words were wrong, and all of them were efforts to abolish the dread of having discovered a household that had found its way into a measure better than men's and worse. One person in town said the word possession in a whisper, and then regretted it. 2 others said mesmerism, as if that made it a city trick. An old woman said old ways and meant nothing unclean by it. A boy from the next farm drew 5 lines on his slate and tapped until his mother took his slate away, and made him shell peas until his hands remembered their purpose. The orchard set fruit, small, hard, reluctant. The first apples dropped without bruise and rolled in a straight line to the same notch in the same root and lay there until someone moved them. A silly thing, and frightening, because rolling is not supposed to be law until you get to a mill. A woman seeing it kicked an apple down a different run and felt ashamed of the comfort that wrongness gave her. The jars, if indeed they held a poor kind of light, were no more cause than the arch or the plank lengths or the low pitch a distant train could throw across a valley. You cannot point at anything the family touched and say, "This is the sin." What could be pointed at was a line scratched on a shed, 5 marks, then a diagonal, done 9 times, then 2 sets cut short, then the tally stopped at 47. Under the tally, "Do not open." It is the Hobson's choice of a town not ready to destroy a house. Either let the figure keep itself or find out what it does when doors are opened all at once and something is allowed to answer itself outright. The family chose for everyone to keep the lids on. The town let them. Then in late March, on a rainless night that sounded like a stove being drawn down slow, the rear room did something the neighbors cannot agree upon, and therefore must be believed. One said the lamp flared blue and threw white into the eyes of the older woman so that she looked like she had glass under her lashes. One said the door bent inward and then sprang back without a crack. One said the tapping stopped in the orchard and resumed in the shed. One said the boy sang 2 notes at once and smiled owlishly at nobody. The parson said nothing at all, which is a statement. Mays wrote only, "Discharge of some sort? Felt in the scalp like hairs rising in a storm. No smell of ozone, no burn." The breath of subjects held and released together in a coordinated manner not commanded by anyone present. He added, "Do not encourage." After that night, the family began a small pilgrimage of dispersal, not by decree but by necessity. The older man went to help a cousin mend a roof and stayed 2 nights. The boy slept at the parsonage under a pallet, and tapped once in sleep and then, as if ashamed, put his own hand to his chest and stilled. The younger woman went to the women's circle and trimmed wick and held babies. In each place, a little of the pattern insisted and then faded when the rooms refused to answer back. The town learned this was possible. It was not a cure. It was a reprieve. When the family returned to the rear room, the measure stood waiting like a line on a page where a child had paused and meant to resume. On the evening of Palm Sunday, the orchard drew a pail as steady as breath. It was a bad light only because it had chosen a beautiful night to show itself. The Angelus threw the familiar double return across the ridge, thicker at the Szgany place than elsewhere. In the second minute after the hour, something like a metronome without a clock made 3 patient corrections in the timber, and in 3 kitchens women put down their knives so they would not tap. Nobody spoke. The terror was not in spectacle. It was in consensus. The war moved louder. Men left. The pump station's whistle changed hands. The town had an alibi for every disturbance now: iron, weather, trains, the strain of grief. But the measure in the rear room needed no alibi, and so it did not give one. The white reflex appeared again once in the boy's eye by lamplight, at an angle so precise Mays could not replicate it with any other child, and therefore declared it an artifact even as his hand wrote the word in a way that said he knew he was preserving courage more than truth. In April, a letter Mays did not mail remained tucked in the back of his notes. "Sim, if you can separate yourselves for a season and walk wrong at the times you love most to be right, you will not extinguish the figure, but you will teach the body that it has a higher law than a room. I cannot promise the orchard will forget. The trees learn quickly and forgive slow." He had written "forgive" as if he thought a tree could. He left it and later burned it, because a doctor is not a priest and should not write as if wood has sins. That same week the parson put a notice in his drawer and not on the church door. "We ask those in fear of the measure to keep their lamps high at dusk, and to sit with company at the second minute after any hour for a fortnight." He never posted it. People did it anyway, because fear has its own bulletin. For a fortnight the town was busier at the wrong minutes than at the right. The measure did not depart. It accommodated itself to the company and waited like a patient tune in a bad room. Then the thing happened that made everyone pretend afterward that nothing had. In the second hour of a warm night, the boy, standing at the rear room threshold, thumped the panel with his knuckles once, just once, at a distance that could be measured against a human breath and found to have a ratio too clean to be chance, and from the orchard there came back a single, unarguable reply, not echo, not wood, not animal, but answer. Men will tell you forever that trees can creak in sympathy and walls can pop and railings will hum when trains pass. Men will tell you that in the heat of grief, the mind makes call and response out of indifferent physics. All this is fine until the moment you have stood with a hand on a jam and felt something you did not summon agree with you as if you had called it by name. The older man said no, very soft as if correcting a child, and put his palm on the boy's chest, and the boy laughed out the breath he had been about to lend to a second knock. The orchard gave nothing else. The room behaved. The law of the house, the one the family had chosen, remained intact. The other law, the one the world had offered, which the family had discovered, remained underfoot, intact also. After that, the count on the shed wall gained one more mark and a diagonal. 47 finished. Under it, someone, maybe the younger woman, maybe the parson who was tired of advising and wanted to agree with the house for once, wrote in smaller hand, Wait for light. It is advice a person can live by and a sentence a house will ignore. Morning came. The orchard went back to wood. The door went back to being a door. The town went back to knives and spoons and a law of wrongness practiced on purpose like a kind of prayer. Spring came up the ridge with that merciless clarity that makes winter's secrets look like deliberate choices. Water ran in the ditch the county had ordered, and the orchard lifted new leaf as if nothing had ever been asked of it in the dark. The rear room kept its quiet with the sulkiness of a child told to behave at company. People watched themselves at table and touched their own breastbones less often. It would have been a good place to stop. A town that had learned to look away. A family that had learned to keep a shape in private. A doctor who had learned to stop measuring a house. But a shape does not forget. It waits. The first sign was small and ignoble. In May, the storekeeper began to find his ledger columns aligning themselves perfectly, even when his hand was tired. Lines and sums that had always wandered into a human wobble came back to the plumb as if the paper wanted to be a ruled slate. He laughed about it once, and then stopped laughing when, in the second minute after the hour, his pencil halted on its own at the end of a column and resumed at the top of the next with a neatness that did not belong to him. He told no one. He spoiled 2 pages on purpose and put the book away. The parson, who had stopped writing rules and learned to keep small instructions folded inside his sermon so nobody would be shamed by them, found that he could begin a hymn in any key and the congregation would set itself gently to a pace he had not asked for, the same pace, whether he tried a march or a lullaby. He learned to break rhythm by dropping a word. It cost him something each time. The hand that had brushed a lintel and felt a door want to move did not like to be the one to make beauty wrong. At the pump station, the retired man with the careful shoulder oiled the whistle and tested the rope on a Saturday when children were allowed to shout. He touched the rope at the top of the hour, and the town got its clean history. He put the rope back into its loop and waited, pretending to be busy. At 2 minutes past, the iron gave a low, dry clearing of its throat. The retired man said nothing, made no entry, and, later that evening, set his flatware asymmetrically and did not correct it. He slept poorly and was proud of it. At the farm itself, the family moved through their work like people who have learned to sing softly when a child sleeps. The older man carried himself as if agreement with the world's small pressures had become a matter of courtesy. The younger woman left windows open even when the wind took liberties, and the room's timber sulked itself dry without being granted the easy satisfaction of a matched breath. The boy, now taller, now a collection of intentions learning to live in a body, stopped humming where men could hear. He walked down to the lane on the hour, and then with visible effort stood still until the wrong minute passed so that his bones would not learn it again. When storms came over the ridge, the orchard behaved like any polite orchard, bent, creaked, stood back up. On one night, though, when the thunder passed and the air resumed that thin brightness that follows a hard rain, the trees took a posture none of their neighbors did. The outer limbs trembled with a metered patience that you could feel on your teeth if you stood with your mouth slightly open. The younger woman stood in the doorway and did not go to them. She folded her hands and looked at the line she had scratched on the shed. 5 marks, diagonal. 5. 5. 5. 9 times full. Then the short sets. Then the taut little sentence. Do not open. She traced the letters with one finger without touching them. Mays came once more, and came not as a savior and not as a judge, but as a man who had a last uninteresting thing to say. He brought bread and a packet of salt as if the family had asked for none of his other offerings and he would try the oldest one. He said, "You are not wrong," he said. "It will not go away because bodies have a better memory than rooms." He said, "Teach your hands to make the wrong marks now and then, or the right marks will make you into a measure." He did not take out his tuning fork. He did not plot a map. He did not press anyone's sternum. He put the bread on the table and his hand on the table and waited until the old man put his hand there too. And in that way, 2 men forgave each other for trying to govern a shape that belonged to neither. There is a clean version of the story that ends there. But the county kept its papers, and the papers kept their habit of recording small disgrace. A school inspector, in the year after the worst of it, wrote in his margin about a girl from the next farm. Taps with left hand during sums. Corrects when teacher applies palm to sternum. Behavior learned at home. He put a question mark there as if that would excuse the fact that he had recognized a gesture out of a winter he wished to grade out of a child. A midwife in a parish 2 ridges over wrote that a woman returned to breath at the second minute after the hour after a faint, and put down her pen hard enough to tear the paper when she realized she had written a minute in a place where she should have written a prayer. She crossed nothing out. She let the shame stand, and finished her note. A tradesman wrote on an invoice. Delivered 20 jars with tight lids. Customer insisted on unlabeled. Paid cash. He drew a line through the word jars and overwrote bottles to make himself feel better, and then pretended not to notice that he had made the distances between the words equal. At the farm, the younger woman took the chalk and scratched one more set of 5 in a diagonal on the shed. 47 finished, and then one more 5. She looked at it and considered whether a count can be undone by a surplus. She added nothing else. She left the chalk in the dirt where a rain could take it. The orchard dropped apples that rolled like coins toward the same root. The family kicked them in the other direction and felt silly and brave. The boy grew up and learned a trade that kept his hands too busy to drum. On Sundays he sat with his jaw loose on purpose and looked at the window and breathed when everyone else breathed. Once, on a day when the light went thin early and the organ coughed a low reed by accident, his pupils took a white throw just for a moment, and the parson did not look away. He held the boy's gaze until it passed, and afterward they shook hands like men who had forgiven each other something. The rear room kept its paneling and its sullenness and its lintel chalk still rubbed into the grain. Nobody pulled it down. Nobody opened both doors at once to force an end. The house continued to ask now and then to be a measure. The family continued, in that patient, ordinary violence that makes communities possible, to deny it without making a spectacle of denial. In the county, the habit leaked. Not much. Just enough that in kitchens you could sometimes tell the moment a lamp was snuffed by the distance between spoon and knife. That at the pump station the leather in the rope would slacken twice in a night and then tighten, as if a small, shy hand had remembered a count. That on an afternoon when a cloud ran across the sun and made a narrow band in the rear room's window, the dust would lift in a line that looked, if you allowed yourself to be hurt by such things, like a stave. The last paper worth mentioning is not worth much. It is a note in a clerk's folder, covenant satisfied, and beneath it, in someone else's hand, hazard has no name. A county can live with anything except a thing that will not be named. The file went to a box. The orchard went to wood. The family went to other names and other houses. The rear room stayed where it was, stubborn, proposing itself to any body standing in it. Years later, the shed still bears the tally if you stand in the right light. 5 and 5 and 5, scratched with a nail, under the soot and the weather and the small disrespect of time. Underneath, if you kneel, you can just make out wait for light. He put the bread on the table and his hand on the table and waited until the old man put his hand there too, and in that way, 2 men forgave each other for trying to govern a shape that belonged to neither. There is a clean version of the story that ends there. But the county kept its papers, and the papers kept their habit of recording small disgrace. A school inspector, in the year after the worst of it, wrote in his margin about a girl from the next farm. Taps with left hand during sums. Corrects when teacher applies palm to sternum. Behavior learned at home. He put a question mark there as if that would excuse the fact that he had recognized a gesture out of a winter he wished to grade out of a child. A midwife in a parish 2 ridges over wrote that a woman returned to breath at the second minute after the hour after a faint, and put down her pen hard enough to tear the paper when she realized she had written a minute in a place where she should have written a prayer. She crossed nothing out. She let the shame stand, and finished her note. A tradesman wrote on an invoice. Delivered 20 jars with tight lids. Customer insisted on unlabeled. Paid cash. He drew a line through the word jars and overwrote bottles to make himself feel better, and then pretended not to notice that he had made the distances between the words equal. At the farm, the younger woman took the chalk and scratched one more set of 5 in a diagonal on the shed. 47 finished, and then one more 5. She looked at it and considered whether a count can be undone by a surplus. She added nothing else. She left the chalk in the dirt where a rain could take it. The orchard dropped apples that rolled like coins toward the same root. The family kicked them in the other direction and felt silly and brave. The boy grew up and learned a trade that kept his hands too busy to drum. On Sundays he sat with his jaw loose on purpose and looked at the window and breathed when everyone else breathed. Once, on a day when the light went thin early and the organ coughed a low reed by accident, his pupils took a white throw just for a moment, and the parson did not look away. He held the boy's gaze until it passed, and afterward they shook hands like men who had forgiven each other something. The rear room kept its paneling and its sullenness and its lintel chalk still rubbed into the grain. Nobody pulled it down. Nobody opened both doors at once to force an end. The house continued to ask now and then to be a measure. The family continued, in that patient, ordinary violence that makes communities possible, to deny it without making a spectacle of denial. In the county, the habit leaked. Not much, just enough that in kitchens you could sometimes tell the moment a lamp was snuffed by the distance between spoon and knife. That at the pump station the leather in the rope would slacken twice in a night and then tighten, as if a small, shy hand had remembered a count. That on an afternoon when a cloud ran across the sun and made a narrow band in the rear room's window, the dust would lift in a line that looked, if you allowed yourself to be hurt by such things, like a stave. The last paper worth mentioning is not worth much. It is a note in a clerk's folder, covenant satisfied, and beneath it, in someone else's hand, hazard has no name. A county can live with anything except a thing that will not be named. The file went to a box. The orchard went to wood. The family went to other names and other houses. The rear room stayed where it was, stubborn, proposing itself to any body standing in it. Years later, the shed still bears the tally if you stand in the right light. 5 and 5 and 5, scratched with a nail, under the soot and the weather and the small disrespect of time. Underneath, if you kneel, you can just make out wait for light.